You're watching The Ready Writer, a show where I get to speak to writers of all different genres, mediums, and experiences. The Ready Writer. Are you ready? Welcome to another episode of The Ready Writer. I am your host, Casey Bell, and today's guest is Jessica Mack. Let's get the show started. So, my first question for you is did you have a childhood dream of becoming an author, or was this an idea that came to you later in life?
Um, I think I think it's just that I didn't have the language for it as a child. Like when I was a kid, one of the things that my mom would do is take me and my brother to the library while my dad was at work. So a lot of my world was being around books, and that felt like home. And stories in general felt like home. So when it wasn't books, it was movies or shows or whatever. So I always wanted to be around stories and liked telling stories and making up characters, but it was only until like later that I was like, oh, when I'm reading these required readings in school, an author wrote these. Maybe I can do what they did. And so it turned into that. And then I realized that I wanted to be an author. But when I didn't have the words for it, I knew that I wanted to be around stories and to make stories. So I guess it was always there, but I had to learn the language for it.
I think that's something teachers need to do better with because I have the same story, but I've wrote so much and I read so much. It didn't, I guess because no one actually said this is something you can do. When you look
Hmm.
at a book, you just read it because your teacher told you to. I don't think we really have the idea that that's something we could do. And so I
Yeah.
find it, I think that's something most people say. So when did you get to the point in your life where you actually said, I'm actually going to do this? Like, I'm really going to do this.
Right. So I know the first story that I was thinking that I wanted to share with the world, and that was my book, Guardians of Massive Memory. And I think one of the catalysts for that, I mean, there are lots of different stories that inspired me, but one of the big stories that inspired me was this show called Avatar: The Last Airbender. And I was really entrenched in like the main plot line, how they had secondary characters that all had meaning. Like each secondary character was just as fun as like the main group of characters. And it was just a fulfilling storyline. And it was so mature for like a kid's show. And I just loved how it was in its entirety. And I was like, I want a world like that. Like in my mind, I was kind of jealous. And I was like, I wish that I was in the room when this was being made. So like that story, I was like, I want it kind of was like a fan fiction almost. And then it transformed into like its own original idea and its own original story and characters. And as I went through more school and learned more about the world and more about like being black and everything like that, then I was like, okay, this story, I want to publish it and I want to write this. And so I was saying that in high school to my friends that like, oh, I want to write this story. And so I was working on it then, worked on it all through college, and just published it last year. So it was really kind of like around middle school time when I was like, oh, yeah, I have a story that I want to share. But of course, I didn't know about the publishing industry and all that kind of stuff. I just knew that at some point I was going to make it a thing.
When did how did you start understanding or knowing about publishing? Because school talks about reading, writing, proper grammar, proper this, proper that. The one thing even college doesn't even really teach about is the process of getting a book published. So
Yeah.
where did you start your journey?
So as far as that goes, it was a little bit between Tomi Adeyemi, the author of Children of Blood and Bone, and my first job in self-publishing. So Tomi Adeyemi, like she wrote Children of Blood and Bone, and I was really excited because even though there were black sci-fi and fantasy books out, there wasn't always a lot of marketing behind them. So you either knew that they existed or you didn't. And so I had to read like Octavia Butler in college and Nnedi Okorafor. And so that kind of got me closer to her stuff. And so when I found her book, I found that she was teaching a writing course called Your Page Turning Plot. And I don't exactly remember how I found it, but it got to a point where it was like, oh, take these like 5 free videos and learn how to write. And then if you want to, you can do like the full course. And I learned so much about writing with like a 3-act structure and how to do all that. And so she was talking about her personal journey, how she queried and stuff like that through a blog post on her website. So I learned about that versus self-publishing. And then I was finishing up my academic career with school and finishing up my degree. And so I applied for this job with a self-publishing company. And I was really breaking in, and I had never worked in publishing before. So I just started as an intern. And so I started with like some little things. And then it got to the point where they recognized that I should be on there full time. And so they asked me to come on full time. And so I did that. And I was able to learn about managing different people's accounts, editing, working with editors and designers, and answering questions. And I was working with other people who had been in like the self-publishing industry, and they worked with like Amazon KDP, like Kindle Direct Publishing and all that kind of stuff, and going to publishing conventions and conferences. So I kept picking up tidbits of information. And it was really through that first job that I learned how you self-publish a book, like Ingram Spark or Kindle Direct Publishing and all that kind of stuff. And then through Tomi Adeyemi, I basically learned how to write. So it was those two things that really helped me break into learning what it means to publish a story and like refine it and all that kind of stuff.
You definitely had an amazing free masterclass on how to publish books being in a publishing company. I think that's amazing. You had that opportunity to be there, learning everything, and then you used it for your own book. So talk about your book, the title, and a brief synopsis of what it's about and the inspiration behind it.
Okay. Yeah. So my book is Guardians of Mass and Memory. And essentially, it's a mix of a few different things, a lot of different inspirations behind it. But the base for it is that it's Afrofuturistic. And essentially, I wanted to write something that was a metaphor for an African American's kind of disenfranchised experience, because the story is about this princess, Black princess named Maleda, in like a fantasy continent of Africa, on like an alternate version of Earth. And so she's living her princess life. And when she least expects it, there's like chaos and turmoil in her kingdom. And so she has to end up running away from the kingdom. And she is involved in an accident and like encounters this murderer. And she finds that she is in this terrifying traumatic situation, and she loses her memory and she has amnesia. So she doesn't remember who she is, and she doesn't remember like her family. She only remembers her name. And so I thought that that was a great comparison for like African Americans, because to an extent we know what it means to like be Black, but the African part in the African American is something that a lot of us don't really have a whole lot of information or connection with. And there's like certain nuances that we don't understand from like the African American perspective. And a lot of it is just like going in ancestry and just saying, oh, well, I'm Nigerian, I've got like Cameroon and this, but we don't really know what all that means. And so this book is kind of a way of diving into that and kind of like recovering what was lost in a way and just navigating what that is, but from her perspective. So she loses her memory. But the thing is, we know that she's a princess because we start out with that part of the journey. So the frustration is we see that we know who she is, but she doesn't. So we're like hoping for her and we're rooting for her to figure out who she is again. So she ends up getting back to the city that she had run away from. And so she's constantly rediscovering herself. And the city itself is based off of a real place called the Empire of Two Shores. And it was this empire that was like the Iberian Peninsula and like the top part of North Africa. And I believe it was a Moorish empire. And it was really advanced, and it had all these different amazing things like paved streets and street lights and all these extensive buildings and libraries and universities and all this kind of stuff. So it sounded so amazing, and I wanted to combine that with like some fantastical inspiration. So some Wakanda vibes and tech and stuff like that, kind of like a future past kind of thing. And so I was really interested in giving her a place like that to have come from and for her to be able to explore in the first book. So this whole book is about her rediscovering who she is and finding the person who was the assassinator and to try to just rediscover herself and her identity.
So I had a question for you, and you said first book, so I think you answered my question. Is this a series or a standalone?
Yeah, I'm actually working on the second book right now. So this is going to be a series. It's going to be at least 3 books, but I'm working on book 2 right now. And in book 2, I'm definitely working on expanding the world even more and diving even more deeply.
So in learning about publishing, what are some of the things in publish when you were working in a publishing company and also now with your own book, what are some of the things that kind of shocked you or surprised you about the what your responsibility is in publishing?
Right. So there was so much information to learn. It was because every day it was like something new. And it was a rare time when it wasn't something new that I wasn't learning at my job. But one thing that I learned that was really important was like marketing. When I was an intern, uh, the company that I was at didn't have a process for press releases. And so I ended up inventing the process for them. And that was really interesting because I was coordinating with the author and we had our own accounts with like these different media outreach companies. So you would have contact emails for people at like Essence Magazine or Oprah Magazine. And not necessarily would they always respond, but you could send them an email and say, hey, this book is coming out. It's about ABC. Maybe you'd be interested. And sometimes we'd get responses back, and authors would get requests for interviews or book reviews and stuff like that. So I really learned how amazing it was to be able to have the contact information for all these like higher ups in like different organizations or magazines, and being able to just reach out and say, hey, this book is here. Maybe you'd be into this. And the other thing that was so interesting that I learned with self-publishing was how much control you're able to have, and how it's like, oh, I have control. And it's also like, oh no, I have control. So you're in charge of like deciding how much editing is going to be done. You're in charge of like, what do I want my cover design to look like? And all this different stuff. Like literally every decision is up to you. And when I was working on my book and actually doing the like self-publishing part and uploading files and formatting everything, it showed I was really hands-on. So I really learned like it's all in your hands. You really got to pay attention to what you're doing and make sure that you're doing it as best as you can. So it was the amount of reach that surprised me, and how cool it was to see who you could reach out to and what it means to be really in control of a project from a self-publishing perspective.
Since you mentioned marketing, I'm making the assumption, according to everything you told me, that you started working at that publishing company prior to the pandemic. So most of your marketing was, normal, regular.
Yeah.
Once, the shutdown started, were you still working there? Did you have to come together to figure out new ways of marketing your authors, or were you not working there? Was that something you had to figure out on your own? What do I do now that I don't have festivals, I don't have book signings? What were some of the things you did to pivot?
Yeah. So I worked at that company like for the beginning of the pandemic, like almost the whole first year of the pandemic, I was working there. And then I transitioned to working for myself. And so the thing that was different for us is when we were reaching out and doing like the press releases and stuff like that, it was still mostly on an email basis. It was very rare that someone would actually like come into the office. So a lot of our communication was either like over the phone or email anyway. But the difference was that we were all at home. So, I would have like my work phone app connected to my cell phone and like be working from my desk at my house. So that was really the big difference. And coordinating with each other like that was interesting, but we still were able to reach out to people. But given the stressors of the pandemic and like the increase in workload given the pandemic and stuff like that, it did make it more challenging. But when it came to marketing on my own, a lot of what I did was festivals. And like you were saying, a lot of in-person festivals had to stop to try to contain COVID and all that kind of stuff. And so I did a virtual festival called Black Ink. And that is a festival in Charleston, South Carolina, and it's been virtual now, like with the pandemic and everything, but it's a festival to celebrate Black authors. And I did it for the second time this year, and I'm going to do it for the third time this year coming up, and talking about like this book again, and then talking about book two. And that was really helpful because when I reached out, I was really new. I hadn't even published my book yet. I just said, like, it's upcoming, it's going to be about ABC. And they were really helpful and open, a lot of communication. And so I was able to participate on panels, and we had like an audience watching us. I even went to a convention this past a few months ago, and I was able to just attend as a participant, but I wasn't on the panel, but we were still able to like talk to each other virtually. And so I was even able to market my book that way unintentionally and just connect with other creatives. So really that connection was still there. It just had to move to a different space. And a lot of it was like online or like through Zoom meetings and stuff like that. So it was just really taking the initiative to reach out, because the worst thing you can be told is no.
All right. So what advice would you give a aspiring writer, author who is in between of actually writing and publishing a book?
Right. So I would tell them that you need to write the story that you need to see, because that's exactly what I did. There's always going to be news and reports from publishing saying like, oh, these genres are trending or these tropes and this different things. That's always going to change, but there's always room for everything. There's always going to be room for like fantasy or vampires or mermaids or nonfiction. There's always going to be room for everything. And your goal isn't necessarily to capture everyone. You're going to have a target audience. And when you think of your target audience, think of yourself as the target. Like, what do you want? And there's going to be a bunch of yous out there who would be interested in what you're writing. So just focus on that. Don't worry necessarily about like, oh, well, my book isn't like so-and-so's book. You're not supposed to be writing so-and-so's book. You're supposed to be writing your book. So just focus on what you want to see and write that. And what if you're doing it like the self-publishing route, I would definitely say to do your research, meaning like if you can't afford an editor, for instance, maybe look at taking editing courses, because that's what I did. I remember doing like some quotes for like developmental and copy editing and proofreading, all this stuff. And I knew that if I were to do all the editing that I needed through all those layers and all those different repetitions, that I wouldn't have been able to afford it. So it was actually cheaper for me to find online classes and training and teach myself like about full stops and making sure that there's this much content on a page and it's not like one sentence left over and all this kind of stuff. So if you need to try to go through those steps, I definitely consider, going through some courses and training, because it's actually wound up being cheaper for me to do it. And once you kind of get started with that, not only will you be more knowledgeable about those things, but as you get the ball rolling and you make more projects and maybe make more income, you could progress to like looking at actually having editors review your work and stuff like that. And even if you can't afford to have someone edit your work, in addition to like the course and trainings, see if you can download a free program that will read your work back to you. Because reading your work in your head, you're going to miss a lot of grammatical errors and stuff like that. But when a computer voice is reading it to you, you're going to hear when something sounds off, or when you missed a word, or when you like left off a letter or something like that. And that'll be an easy way to like correct yourself as like one of those preliminary steps before you really get into it. So I would definitely tell you to, write what you want to write and focus on that, and think of you as your target audience. And if you can't afford necessarily to go through all the editing steps and stuff like that, take some classes and train yourself in the meantime so that you can try to work through it that way. And try to get a program. And there's lots of free programs out there. I think one is called Natural Reader, and use that to like read your work back to you so that you can really hear what you're saying.
I like that idea, the natural readers idea, downloading an app or a software that reads it back to you. Because I know when I write, many times I leave out a letter or the wrong word is something that I didn't intend.
Yep.
So thanks for sharing that idea. So Is there an author out there that inspires you so much, whether they be dead or alive, that if you had the chance to have a conversation with them, who would it be and why?
That's a hard question. Um, I mean, there's a bunch of different authors that have inspired me and that I just find to be really compelling and interesting. I remember the last time an author really shocked me was when I found out about Octavia Butler. I was in college in like my first writing class that I had to take. And it was more like an English class, but we were like doing different samples of different readings. And we had to read Octavia Butler, and I had no idea who she was. And we had to read Lilith's Brood. And that was a story about this Black woman who was like taken up into space by aliens. And she's with some other humans, and these aliens, the way that she describes them is that they're indescribable. And she tries to really get across how fantastical and scary this experience is. But the thing that really struck me was that she was just a regular Black woman. Like, she was a Black woman that would make you think more of like your mom or your grandmom, with her short afro and a deep voice. And she wrote science fiction, and she like came from the Baptist church, and she like moved into science fiction and well, not fantasy, science fiction. And I was just fascinated that she existed and that I didn't know, and that the first time that I'd heard of her was when I was in college. And then I'd found like Nnedi Okorafor and Tomi Adeyemi and all those different people, and that was amazing. But I guess I would, if I were to talk to her, I would want to ask her about what inspired her first story, or like where was she looking, and what really like captured her and made her want to tell stories. Because I know for me, like I talked about the stories that I saw, but even music is such an integral part of like how I write. Because growing up, my mom didn't really want me to listen to secular music, and so it wasn't like I had an iTunes account and stuff like that, and it was really just what was in the house. So when she wasn't playing gospel, I was looking through her CDs, and she had like things that you would not think would inspire this book, but it did. Like, she had Whitney Houston, she had Alicia Keys, and she had India Irie. And the three particular albums that she had really inspired me because I'm really visual. So when I heard the music, I saw the story. And so like certain songs are tied to certain chapters, even chapters that haven't been written yet. So I just want to sit down with her and say, like, what struck you? Was it the way the wind blew? Was it a song you heard? Like, I would just want to talk to her about her inspiration and how she pushed through to write her stories, because what she wrote for who she is, just as a regular Black woman, I just think that that's so fascinating, because it shows you that, oh no, this is possible. Like, your grandma down the street could write the story if she wanted to. And that camaraderie just makes me feel so good. And I just want to pick her brain and figure out like what were her inspirations.
That is all the time we have for you today on The Ready Writer. I want to thank our guest, Jessica Mack, for stopping on by and sharing her journey. And of course, you, the audience, thank you for watching.